So I didn't have to warn you about these sewing up his own mouths.
Yeah.
That's where the Joker came from.
Yeah, that could well be true.
That's, yeah, I went to, there's a movie that came out, this is 30 years ago now, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, Her Lover, and a guy takes a fork to the cheek in that movie, and that was one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen on film in my life until this, and that was kind of gross too. So, yeah. Larry, Guillermo del Toro, give us kind of the biography here, and kind of where this fits into his filmography, if you don't mind.
Just a little bit of history that I thought was kind of cool when I dug it out. He decided at 8 that he might be interested in doing things with movies. Of course, living in Mexico, he began experimenting with a Super 8 camera, and he made films with his Planet of the Apes toys and other objects that he found around the house. And his first masterwork was about a serial killer potato that was killing everybody that he knew. And in the end, it had ambitions of world domination, but it stepped outside the house and was run over. So that happens if you're not careful.
It got mashed.
Exactly, it got mashed. He made 10 short films before his first feature, which was Kronos. And his first movie was, he was dreamed of making a stop motion animation film. And he worked on it, and he worked on it, and it was going to be called Omnivore. It was about a lizard man born in a strange land where everything ate everything else. That was just, that's all that happened in that land. He and his team built sets. They built 100 puppets over a 3-year period to prepare to film Omnivore. And then vandals burglarized the studio one night and destroyed all the puppets and sets, thus wasting 3 years of his time. And then he said, it would just be a lot easier if I made a live action movie with people. So he made Kronos, his first film. It's interesting, he has many, many motifs that run through all of his films. One of them is an obsession with time. You have this weird thing with his watch here. Kronos is about the control of time. If you remember Hellboy, there was a character whose lair is completely populated by clocks. I'm not really sure what exactly this time thing is, but I'll run down for you some of the motifs that last. Often he has scenes where people go underground, away from the world as we know it. That happens in Mimic, about the giant insects that mimic human beings. Happens in Hellboy, happens here. Happens in the water, in Shape of Water. In The Devil's Backbone, they're in a big basement, they go into a swimming pool. Clocks, I mentioned. A lot of his films have portals that lead to other worlds. This is true but weird. Often he depicts graphic trauma to the face.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a common theme for him, but that I don't get. He loves Gothic architecture, which you see a little bit represented in The Other World here. And his works often have really striking otherworldly creatures with inhuman appearances, but frequently they are either sympathetic or could be sympathetic, and you don't really know. What Pan represents here could be a creature that really cares about that girl. Or it could be a creature who's manipulating that girl, or it could just be some sort of otherworldly sadist who likes to do evil for its own sake. And he's, I think the most important thing that you need to know about Guillermo del Toro was something he said about himself as a child. He said, I was fat, homely, lonely, and did not know how to communicate with people. Whether he's fat and homely is left to anybody to decide, but his loneliness is absolutely the thing that is at the center of all of his movies. His movies are about neglected children or adults who are childlike, like the mute woman who's working in The Shape of Water. Mm-hmm. It's about people who are not just not fitting in well with society, but shunned by society, like the gay character that Richard Jenkins plays in Shape of Water, who is humiliated for his sexual preference. And clearly he empathizes with the alienated and the lonely and the outcast. And in film after film after film, that is what ties the themes together. Well, I mean, he makes movies where that's not absolutely central, certainly Nightmare Alley. But most of the time, there's a character that's misunderstood, even grotesque, who turns out to be sympathetic or to connect you to a better place.
And Nightmare Alley is a film full of grotesque characters.
And Nightmare Alley has its store of grotesqueries and all the people who work around the carnival. They're a little more peripheral, but they're certainly there. This is Del Toro's vision of himself, which he repeats over and over and over and over.
So my issue with Nightmare Alley, which I watched a couple years ago when it came out, was it was so sort of overstuffed, and we're talking at dinner about how there's kind of a running theme of that in many of his films. He's kind of a shiny object guy.
That's a little cruel, but
I mean, he just sort of, in comparison to some of the other filmmakers we've talked about in this series, Fincher being king among them, you know, who are very disciplined and on message and very focused in their work. Scorsese, certainly, Eastwood. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't, right?
well, I mean, he is a director, Del Toro, who, and he said this himself in interviews, anything that interests him, he has a hard time resisting shoving into the film. He read The Legend of the Mandrake, which actually is not about, it's to get women pregnant. The old medieval legend was if you dug up a mandrake at midnight, I think it was, and you put it under the bed of a woman who was barren or infertile, she would conceive. Well, this woman's obviously not barren, she's about to conceive. But he read about the mandrake and he said in an interview, it was too cool not to include. It is kind of cool. I mean, when they throw it in the fire and it looks like a little baby and it's kicking and writhing and it's wrinkling up its little mandrakey face. That is cool. It doesn't fit the legend of the mandrake, and it certainly doesn't need to be in the movie, really. But he is the kind of guy who, I think shiny object makes it sound like a dog chasing a squirrel. I think he's someone who is fascinated by all of the mythology he reads and all of the history he reads. And he can't stop shoving it into his films. I give him a lot of slack, cut him slack for that, because he's visually so inventive and he's stimulating to me that when he gets sloppy and loose and wanders off point, kind of okay. Also, it's a 2-hour movie. If it was 2 hours and 45 minutes, I'd want to cut a bunch of it. But here I just see things that go by and I think, that doesn't really have to be in there, but it's interesting, why not? And that's who he is.
Yeah. So let's pivot and talk about some of the imagery here. We put it in the sort of fantasy genre. There's a lot of horror elements in this film as well. We talked about some of the body horror already, but a lot of the grotesqueries of the creatures that are featured in this film, you know, they could come from a horror film just as well. I kept sort of flashing on the whole alien thing, like there were just aspects of this that seemed to, like, not H.R. Geiger type stuff, but like it just feels, and the horror of the toad and the toad sort of belching himself inside out, like just the visual imagery of this film is one of the more striking aspects of it.
Well, I think the main difference for me between most fantasy and most horror is fantasy generally has rules in which the protagonist is attempting to succeed or not succeed, and if they follow the rules, they will win to their objective.
Don't eat the grapes.
And if that's right, it's not like she eats the grapes and finds out she's going to get chased around by the pale man with the eyes in his hands. She's told, this is a rule, you have to go down there and get this thing and bring it back. That's fantasy or fairy tale. And don't eat the grapes. If you don't eat anything on the table, she's told, then you will be safe. You'll come back. So in a horror film, there isn't any kind of structure where your quest will succeed if you do the right things. You're as likely as anybody else to get a spear in your head. So,
although Scream taught us there are very clear rules about who gets the spear in the head.
well, jokingly, joking rules, yeah. But I mean, this kind of structure this is the way, there is order in this universe. In a horror universe, there's no order, there's disorder. And what's horrifying is it can strike at anybody at any time from any place. This is a cruel and unforgiving universe, but it's a universe that has structure. And in a fantasy world, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Narnia or wherever you want, those places have structure and order and rules. Horror has no rules and it has no order.
Yeah. So the other thing I flashed on here was the fairy tale. There's the conversation between the mom and the daughter early on, where she tells her, "You're too old to be reading these fairy tales," and of course what we realize is that the fairy tales that she's reading and the fairy tale that comes to life here is much more like not the fairy tales you used to tell children to get them to go to sleep at night and calm down, but much more like sort of the Grimm brothers fairy tales of very primal, fear-based, where the Little Red Riding Hood actually gets eaten, where the Three Little Pigs actually get eaten. She's living in a world of fairy tales with real stakes in them and real sort of tinged with that horror that we talk about. You were talking about the origins of the Cinderella story.
There's the original Cinderella, not the Charles Perrault version that we know with the happy ending and all that, the French version. There's a version of Cinderella where the two stepsisters, in an attempt to convince the prince that they are the ones who should fit into the slipper, cut off their toes and figure, it's a little tiny slipper, if I have no toes I should fit into it just great, and that won't matter because I'll be the princess and people will bring me things, I don't have to walk around. Not only are they found out to be frauds, so they're now missing their digits, but their punishment for lying is that ravens come and pluck out their eyes. So that's harsh, right? I mean, they didn't treat Cinderella very well and they told lies, but now they have no eyes and no toes. That's cold. So real fairy tales that were generative before they became pleasantly adapted to
Disney movies.
And then life in a gentler time when people wanted warmth and ease in their fairy tales. They were about punishment, fatality, risk of life, blindness, limb. Everything is at stake the way it is for the girl here. The fairy tale is not, if it doesn't go well, she'll have an unpleasant stepfather. The fairy tale is, if it doesn't go well, the world will collapse. And I just have to say this, I was telling Claire this, first time I saw this in a theater 18 years ago, I was the film critic for the Charlotte Observer then, and a woman came up to me and said, "I need you to explain the ending." And I said, "Okay." And she said, did she really go to be the queen of the underworld, or did she just die, and while she was dying, she had a vision that she was the queen of the underworld? And I said, "How would I know?" "I don't know." And the woman said, "Oh, I don't like that." And I said, You don't like that I don't know?" She said, "No, I don't like that it's ambiguous. I want the filmmaker to tell me she's in a happy fairy tale place, or she died, and I don't want to have to guess." Well, it is true that most fairy tales end very distinctly with what does or doesn't happen. But this one ends with her fulfilling her quest, just to save her baby, and indirectly to frustrate her would-be stepfather. He is her stepfather. And that's the end. The end is she fulfilled her quest. Whether or not she goes on to something, we have no idea. But that's also what I mean. You do know that what the ending is. The ending is she saved her half-brother. That's the ending. So beyond that, I can't say.
What did folks think of the mother character here? I really struggled with her. Did people find her sympathetic, her situation sympathetic, her actions with regard to her daughter sympathetic? Thoughts?
I'm curious how much she knew about the stepfather's antics.
Yeah.
How aware was she that he was evil?
Yeah, there's sort of a willful ignorance there on her part that that was the part I think that I stumbled on a lot, was like she seemed almost obtuse about the true character of her husband.
We were talking about that at dinner, and I would say that 80 years ago in Spain, especially Spain that had just gotten out of a civil war, there was very little opportunity for women, especially women who are already mothers, except to remarry. I mean, there would have been no jobs for her. There would have been no prospects for her. She didn't seem very well educated. And her goal in life, I think, was to provide another father who absolutely meant security. If you were married to an army officer on the way up in Falange, Spain, that was like the most secure marital gig you could get. And she was, I think, doing that for her daughter and her future son, and not really caring too much about what that meant for her. There's one line that she says, something that I can't quote it, but the gist of it is, we just have to sort of do what he wants and it'll be fine. You know, he's harsh, but we just have to understand what he's telling us to do and we do it. And I think that I have empathy for her because I think she's totally out of options. Her other option is, I don't know, to beg, or where she doesn't seem to have family. So what is she going to do with a child if she doesn't marry? And marrying this guy, unpleasant as he is, he actually, when he thinks she's giving him a son, is not unpleasant to her in what he means for kindness.
And the film, of course, contrasts her with the Mercedes character, who is of a lower class in general, does not have the same life expectations, but is then free to sort of live toward her own ideals.
Well, and is childless.
And
So whatever happens to Mercedes happens only to her. She doesn't have to sacrifice herself for someone to prevent harm coming to anybody, or her brother a little bit. But it's more about, I can do what I want with my life. But again, she's a maid. Financially, in that society, she didn't have any options either. And she's taking a menial job, but following her ideals, a risk the mother can't afford or doesn't think she can afford to take.
And did this one best cinematography?
Cinematography, art direction, and makeup, obviously, which is pretty easy to give that to. I mentioned it didn't win foreign film. I think it was nominated for screenplay. It didn't win that. What it mainly did was elevate Del Toro to the rank of a serious filmmaker. He had made other films. I like Mimic, actually. I'm one of the few people I've met who does.
He'd made the first Hellboy before this.
He'd made the first Hellboy before this, and people went, okay, that's a pretty fun comic book movie. All right, I get it. He'd made obscure Spanish language films that hadn't gotten any kind of attention really in the mainstream US. This was the movie that said, here is an imaginative talent and imaginative and visual talent that we didn't see coming. Nobody who saw Hellboy, I think, okay, it had characters that were a little bit otherworldly, but nobody seeing that thought, man, this guy has Pan's Labyrinth in him, it'll be great. And this was where he taught people, I count for something, I really have chops.
Yeah, and I feel like in the creatures in this in particular, you see a sort of lineage going forward into the next decade of visual language, how grotesques are depicted, and some things that end up mixed into the horror films of the 2010s.
I want to talk about insects for a minute, just because I like them so much. He said, this is a strange quote from Del Toro, I think insects are as close as we come in the real world, insects and deep sea creatures, so remember, Shape of Water is in the future, to having monsters walk amongst us. It's always shocking to me to remember what the insect biology is, and how these creatures have no real heart, they just have hollow chambers, they pump white blood, they have 6 or more eyes, they have 6 legs, they have a hard shell, they have no skeleton. That's an incredible design. They're like perfect. And that makes them very, very scary. When I was a kid, I used to think about archangels, which were the soldiers of God, the tough guys. They came in, they did the dirty jobs, and I always thought that somehow all archangels would look like insects if you actually saw them. So his fascination with insects extends to other films as well. And in a way, maybe that's what clocks are about, because insects are mechanical designs that have a mechanistic quality that has no other purpose. But he's really, really interested in insects. All sorts of otherworldly creatures too. I mean, the fawn, the original version of the fawn of this actually looked like what we see, little illustrations of Pan, who had little horns, and he had, you know, like a goat body and little hooves and a human torso. The way you see illustrations of Pan in Greek mythology. And then he decided Pan was going to get weirder and weirder and weirder and be part of the earth, so that he crumbles and pieces, little bits come off him. And he looks like he's made out of moss and wood and natural things, roots. And the idea was, he's a god, an earth god. He's not part human anymore. He's entirely alien, entirely otherworldly. So Pan was supposed to start out part human, and as Del Toro got deeper and deeper into the story, said, I don't want anything in it to be remotely human except the humans, who, except for the girl and a little bit the mother and Mercedes, are leading pretty horrible lives.
Thoughts, questions, comments, reactions to the film?
One thing I would say is there's a lot of religious imagery in it. He was obviously raised as a Catholic in Mexico. Well, not obviously, there's some people in Mexico who aren't Catholics, but most of them are, and he was. And he said, I'm not a Catholic anymore, but everyone who was a Catholic will always be a Catholic on some level. He said, I don't believe in the afterlife, for example, but influences of Catholicism are in this film, in The Shape of Water as well, baptism imagery, and not just baptism, but the water that renews. I think there's a real feeling in him that I'm reaching for something. I don't want life, especially life in this terrible period for Spain, to just be the end. But he said, I don't believe there's anything left beyond life. And that's very difficult for me, as Del Toro speaking, because it means that what I see here is all there's going to be, and I don't like what I see here. And I think that may explain partly why he imagines alternative worlds. Because in those worlds, you can, at least in your own vision, in your own mind, have a sense that things are ordered and structured, and you can win and achieve a goal and succeed. I don't know what it's like to feel religious stirrings, but also believe there's not a God. Del Toro, in the 2 interviews I read where he talked about that, couldn't really explain it, and I can't explain it either.
Yeah, but it puts a different gloss on the question of the ending as well, right? Because if he personally does not believe that there is an afterlife,
Then that girl is lying dead at the edge of a well.
and that's the end of it. The other sort of obvious religious imagery or religious trope, or if you would have it, the Old Testament thing of the slaughter of an innocent or sacrifice of an innocent that she's supposed to commit at the end there.
Very Abrahamic.
Yes, absolutely.
I did have one other thing I definitely wanted to say, or 2 other things, sorry. Sound like Monty Python. There are 3 other things I want to say. One of them is, children are important to him, as I mentioned, and when he talks about his favorite films, almost all of his favorite films are films in which children are menaced or killed. You may draw from that psychologically what you want. The Innocents, the adaptation of Henry James' novelette Turn of the Screw, Night of the Hunter, Spirit of the Beehive. He lists this long list of films, and they're films in which children are threatened or killed. I guess that has to do with maybe feelings of insecurity as a child. One interesting sidebar, I don't know, nothing to do with children. His father was kidnapped in Mexico when he still lived there. He doesn't live there now. And they assumed that Del Toro was rich. This is before Pans. And they kidnapped his father and wanted a large ransom, and he couldn't pay it. And he could pay some of it. And one of his filmmaking buddies, James Cameron, came to the rescue. See, James Cameron has done something of value in the last 20 years. And, did I say that out loud? I'm sorry.
Inspired.
And, and he helped pay the ransom, and Del Toro's father came back. Then Del Toro said, let's get out of Mexico, this is crazy, we're not gonna live here. And he moved to the States. But his anxiety about children and the unprotectedness of childhood is a theme that runs through. And his dream project, I'll talk about for a minute, is to make a Frankenstein. Not to make a Frankenstein, to make a film of Frankenstein. For all I know, he's making a Frankenstein. He owns 3 houses, 2 of which are filled with memorabilia that he has collected over the decades. For all I know, there's a lab table in there with a giant lightning bolt that goes through the ceiling. But he's working on a Frankenstein movie off and on now, and he said, Frankenstein is a fetish that I have to an unhealthy degree. It's the most important book in my life, and I think about it constantly. And he had casting for it earlier this year. That casting changed. Then I heard it was on hiatus. Then I heard it wasn't on hiatus. But if you think about it, that's about another unhappy child rebelling against his creator, a child that is an outcast, that rebels against authority, that in its frustration at being misjudged and abused becomes violent and takes action that is harmful to those around it. It's another monster that's misunderstood, can't fit into conventional society, and begins to cause destruction. And if anybody can tell that story, it's Guillermo del Toro. So that's a movie I'd like to see.
All right.
All right.
I think that's all we got, unless people have additional questions or comments or thoughts on the film. So we're gonna be back in 2 weeks with Arrival, which
Right.
is
Right.
our selection for a science fiction film from the last 30 years. And very much in one of the more intellectual science fiction films you'll ever see. Very much in contrast to Star Wars or that ilk. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to do, that's 2 weeks from tonight, Spirited Away on September 10th, and then we'll finish with There Will Be Blood on October 1st.
Before we go, I have to say about the science fiction choice, it came down to 2 movies I really, really like and have seen multiple times. Arrival, which we're showing, and Ex Machina, a film I really enjoy. And we talked and talked. That was like the only choice out of the first 10 where I just could not decide what to show, and did kind of a mental coin flip and came up with Arrival. But if you have never seen Ex Machina, since we won't be talking about it, please do. It's a terrific movie.
Yeah, one of Alex Garland's best movies.
Yeah, the best.
Yeah. So,
All right.
all right.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all for coming. We enjoyed it.